I am Edward October. The sound you hear is howling alpine winds. This is the start of Octoberpod. Exterior, Swiss Alps, 19th century. A young man, young, but with the appearance and air of a much older man, struggles over a forgotten, seldom-traveled path between the mountains. He is searching for the answer to a question that he has not yet asked himself. Boughs of spruce and fir grown overhead, blocking out the setting sun and doing little to protect the man from the driving wind.
What the hell is that? Drums? Out here? Herr Waldman assured me that this mountain pass was quite uninhabited. Hello? Who's banging those drums?
3 sisters, crones, witches, emerge from blackness between the fat trunks of the oldest timbers in the forest. They wear brown, mud-spattered rags that flap in the blowing gale. One of the crones wears a bandage over her face, for she is blind. The other 2 look on with wild eyes that catch the light, like the eyes of a stalking predator.
Hail the noble Baron Frankenstein!
Hail the Honorable Dr. Frankenstein!
Hail the modern Prometheus!
Hail Victor Frankenstein!
The Satanic Rites of Frankenstein. Adapted especially for Octoberpod by John Eiger, from the novel Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and from the play Macbeth by William Shakespeare, starring Adam Turner, co-host of Diabolical Podcast, as Victor Frankenstein, with Chrisi Talyn Saje, creator and producer of Madison On The Air, Emma, co-star of Spine Chillers and Serial Killers, and YouTube's Lady Spookaria.
3 sisters dancing about our witch's pyre. We call upon the powers of light and of fire.
Round and round we dance about, thrice to thine and thrice to mine, and thrice again to make up 9.
O ye great demons of hell, wind up the charm of our mystic spell.
Stop it! Stop that damn stupid dancing! Do any of you ladies know Professor Waldman from the University of Ingolstadt? He told me I could find knowledge and enlightenment in this place.
Waldman? Oh, yes, we know him well, don't we, sisters?
We have knowledge and enlightenment to give you.
Just not the sort you'd like to hear.
I'm on the brink of some very important scientific discoveries. If you hags know anything that would help me in my research, I'd have you tell me.
Drums. Somewhere among the trees, a drummer is drumming. Victor cannot see them, and he peers into the darkness between the trees to see if he can spy them. And then in the space between the blinking of his eyes, a steaming cauldron appears at the sisters' feet. A parlor trick, he tells himself. The weird sisters hunch over the boiling pot, their haggard faces disappearing in a pillar of green vapor, seeking portents amid the undulating liquid.
There, in the witch's stew, a vision from your past. These events live in your memories, yet you have not wisdom. Hearken! I am Justine Moritz. I've always watched him very closely.
Charged with his well-being, how could I not?
A
A sharp mind, he has always observed and absorbed everything he encountered, effortlessly understanding the loftiest of subjects. His inner workings tick away for hours on the minutiae of his subject until he is content that no more questions could be posed that he could not answer. I watched, and with everything in my power, I protected Victor Frankenstein.
Baron Frankenstein, written by Amber Jourdan, co-host Witches Talking Tarot, narrated by Johanna, co-host of Fresh Hell Podcast.
I watched as he combed his hair in a cloudy mirror outside his bedchamber. He could not see me, but I could tell from a twitch of his lips that he was aware of my presence. Victor insisted upon mastery over everything he touched, and so he took care that each strand of his hair was placed just so. My duty as a governess was to ensure that he has all the tools to achieve total mastery of his life. At noon, we would bury Victor's father, Baron Frankenstein. As we prepared for the funeral services, I could see that Victor was unsettled and growing more and more melancholy with each passing moment. At times, he seemed agitated. At others, he seemed reflective. My main focus remains on Victor's well-being, especially following the sudden passing of his beloved father. The Baron had died suddenly in the night, 3 years to the day since the passing of Victor's sweet mother. Little William and Elizabeth were aware, and the house was empty save Victor, myself, and the upstairs maid. It was Victor who had found his father dead, and Victor who had urged me to send a coach to fetch the drunken old doctor in the village. It was nearly dawn when the old physician arrived and pronounced the Baron dead after a most hasty and cursory examination. The death certificate, which I myself witnessed, stated the cause of death as the visitation of God. Young Victor insisted on personally escorting the bibulous doctor back to his coach. I watched as Victor thrust a fistful of banknotes into the pocket of the doctor's overcoat. Later, Victor ordered all of the upstairs staff to clean the Baron's body in preparation for his funerary rites. Victor was a man possessed of an almost electric energy, overseeing every detail of this ritual of bathing the dead. He flew into a rage when one of the foolish girls pointed out a strange bruise on the Baron's temple and black stain upon his lips. Victor dismissed her without severance at that very instant. Everyone assumed Victor would be melancholical and mournful in his grief, but they do not know my Victor like I do. I watched his dark studies as bouts of melancholy overtook him, and I was obliged to comfort him in ways I cannot fully express. I will speak no more on that. Now the young Baron, having inherited the entirety of his father's lands and titles, Victor could finally explore all that life could offer a man of his standing and natural brilliance. Some months later, Victor's father was to be honored posthumously for his many philanthropic achievements by the city of Geneva. I traveled with Victor, his brothers, and his adopted sister Elizabeth to the ceremony in Geneva, where Victor gladly accepted the award on behalf of his father. Our Monsieur, the late Baron, was a truly blessed soul who had spread his blessings to all who approached him. At the ceremony, Victor was immediately embraced by his dear friend Monsieur Clerval. A better friend one could not ask for. Always understanding and supportive, Victor and Henri have been fast friends since practically infancy. Henri is timid and malleable, qualities I observed Victor quite appreciated in his companions and contemporaries, but especially elders. Henri is Victor's dearest friend in the whole world, however, and knows him better than anyone else, possibly even more than myself. As I beheld them, I saw Henri examine Victor very closely. His eye and mind were far less sharp than my Victor's, but I knew he also detected something was amiss in Victor's melancholy countenance. Henri placed his hand on Victor's shoulder, looked him squarely in the eye and stated openly, although quietly, "When you are ready to tell me what's become of your father, I will listen and do what is necessary." To which Victor nodded solemnly and, I swear, seemed to beam from within, as though he had finally solved the puzzle which had plagued him for so long. Later, at the Chateau Frankenstein, I sat documenting the events of the fortnight we spent in Geneva. Victor joined me in the sitting room and produced his father's Bible. Victor sat very close to me and he read aloud from Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed the man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. If only our monsieur, the late Baron, could see his eldest son's dedication to his father's life and legacy. Victor, I said, as I set my pen aside for a moment, tell me, when God created man, what do you believe were his intentions? Creating life, Victor said, and having control over life is a thrill beyond comprehension. It excites the system and delights all aspects under the sun. Feeling the surge as your creation takes on the essence of being, seeing the viable specimen prevail to realize life and its functions. Victor's eyes widened in excitement. I believe God's motivation was satisfying his own curiosity. Could he do it? Could he create life? Would he succeed? Would his creation exceed his very expectation? Gods create life for their own desires, their own impulses of want and interest. Victor responded with such enthusiasm, his tender, pallid cheeks flushed full of life and blushed a vigorous pink. I have often contemplated this, I said, as Victor leaned closer to me, watching me, his lips nearly close enough to kiss me. Do you believe God properly succeeded in the first, or do you believe there is more to know on such matters? Victor straightened his posture and said, even gods must perfect their creation through trial and failure, through effort and suffering. One experiment after another, each time eliminating that which is most definitely causing problems and improving the process. As I watched the life that teems in and around the lands of our home here in Ingolstadt, I wondered what possesses the creatures to carry on. Where was their desire? And it occurred to me they have no desire. They are imbued with the desire of their creator. Their creator desired them to till the land, distribute the seed, strip the flesh from the fallen animal, break down the fallen tree. Their creator desired it and designed them to be an instrument of his desire. Just as God began and began again, all gods must experience the dissolution of a creation not unlike Lilith, requiring to be banished from their realm, to be replaced with that which was intrinsically superior. And, dearest Victor, I said, is this how you felt last week after you read from the book, the night your father died? I was there, Victor. I was there in your father's bed chamber. You could not see me, but I know you felt my presence. In the shadows. I watched as you sat at the foot of his bed to read to him from the Bible. And then, once he'd fallen asleep, I watched as you poured poison into his yawning mouth. I watched the horror in his eyes as you forced his mouth closed, pinching his nose. He threshed so violently that he bruised his temple on the bedpost. And after he died, I told no one what I'd seen. I did this to protect you, and to protect the promise of who you must become. The Baron had to die in order for you to become what you will become. This feeling that you speak of, the disillusionment of a god, is this how you felt after seeing your father's transformation from this life to the next? And upon learning you were now Baron of these lands, that you had become the benevolent new ruler over the House of Frankenstein? The Bible dropped to the floor with a thud. Victor's eyes looked dreamy and distant. Then he smiled and said, "Let me show you something, Justine, my beloved." He led me to a seldom used wing of the chateau and down a winding secret passageway which led to the family crypt. There, among the bones and rot of Victor's ancestors, lay the mortal remains of Monsieur Frankenstein, the old Baron, on a stone slab. He'd been disinterred from his tomb. Upset candles and the petals from a wreath of flowers littered the stone floor. Victor led me to his father's side and produced some technical equipment from one of the recesses in the stone walls. It was a box from which wires and tubes protruded like the legs of a grotesque insect. One of the tubes had a needle or sharp probe attached to one end. This Victor inserted into his dead father's neck. He handed me the box and instructed me to manipulate the little crank on it. There was a spark of electricity and a whiff of sulfur, and then the dead man's eyes fluttered open and turned up toward the grinning face of his son. A loving father, as always, our former Baron. A hideous grin, pride, oozing from his every ounce of his being.
monsters do have their place. In the zoo, in your nightmares, in the deep, in your favorite horror movies, but not on your phone during an ad break. Politically motivated interests are seeking to influence you through the ads placed on this podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Edward October, reminding you that we have very limited control over the ads you hear on Octoberpod. Please remember that only the ads and promos I read with my own voice carry the endorsement of Edward October and Octoberpod. Furthermore, I and the makers of Octoberpod repudiate any entity advertised which seeks to promote hatred, anti-American or anti-democratic sentiments, or the spread of misinformation. Now, with that in mind, Octoberpod will return after this brief ad break.
How dare you? How dare you insinuate such things? I received my lands and my title honorably. I am no murderer.
Still, he has no wisdom.
Aye! And yet in his heart he sees the truth of our prophecy.
I see truth only in what is observable through the scientific method. You're nothing but frauds and charlatans, the lot of you.
Frauds? Charlatans? Well then, enjoy another of our parlor tricks.
She thrusts her head into the pot, her face so close to the stew that her hooked nose nearly brushes the roiling surface of the pungent liquid. Her eyes light up, possessed of an otherworldly green light. When she speaks again, she is speaking on behalf of the spirit world.
I am the woman called Sana. He works at night and no one witnesses what I witness.
I guess you can say that I've grown accustomed to the screaming and moaning of the technical equipment he uses to defile all the corpses I steal for him. What I do is not for the weak.
Dr. Frankenstein, written especially for Octoberpod by Actually Olga, narrated by Karyn Raynor, co-host of Chick-Lit Podcast.
Cholera overtook the city before I met Dr. Victor Frankenstein. First came a frenzy of panic, then a rush into the arms of the church to pray to a sterile white god for salvation. They thought that stray cats were carrying the pestilence into their homes, so they killed all the cats that they could round up, especially black cats. Black is the color of darkness and the unknown, an unclean color, an evil color. They were suspicious of women who lived alone, women like me. Whores, they called us. Spinsters, they called us. Witches, they called us. The fires blocked out the sun with their black smoke. One could never tell if it was from a pyre of corpses, cholera victims, or another witch burned at the stake. You see, these men grew fond of the smell of charred female flesh. The surgeons were just as cruel. They opened their operating theaters to onlookers, usually respected pillars of the community, men with secret, lecherous tastes, to witness science merging with God. I was one of the women hired to assist in these procedures. Most of these women couldn't stomach the butchery these surgeons inflicted on the mostly female cadavers. Evisceration, dissection of sexual organs in search of abnormalities. Most of these female medical assistants, all attractive young women, swooned or fled the operating theater to be sick, while the men on the other side of the glass looked on and laughed. I am unlike any of these women, however. I once handed a scalpel to a surgeon who proceeded to amputate a street woman's left arm below the elbow. She was still alive, barely, and too heavily sedated to struggle, but still able to scream. God, how she screamed. That is, until she resigned herself to the reality that she had nothing left to fight for. She doesn't matter, the doctor had said. She'd never used her hands for anything but begging, picking a gentleman's pocket, and whoring. She'd likely be dead in a fortnight, with or without our intervention. Assisting the medical butchers was honest work, as honest as a woman like me could find, and I quickly grew accustomed to the screech of metal-rending bone, the squelches of flayed skin, and the squealing of the lost souls who died wide awake on the surgeon's slab. But I never grew accustomed to the stench of death, or the buzzing of the countless flies that swarmed over dead flesh. Some nights the buzzing keeps me awake. Some nights I imagine the flies crawling over me, making me itch. Some nights I scratch at the flies until I draw blood. I have a hard time sleeping. I met the Right Honorable Baron Victor Frankenstein, now a celebrated doctor and alleged humanitarian, one chilly autumn night. I was in an alley behind the hospital discarding a human kidney that had gone maggoty, and a bit of fatty liver for a pack of stray dogs to eat. The dogs were feral and roamed the streets like a wolf pack, so it was only common sense to remain in their good graces. Without any cats about, the dogs were all that kept vermin like rats and mice at bay, and even then they were abundant. Frankenstein said he'd heard I was a skilled nurse. Ja, mein Herr, I said. But what I do is closer to the work of a butcher's apprentice. He smiled at that, and the look of mania and sadness in his wild eyes frightened me. He tossed a purse full of gold coins at my feet and told me I would work only for him now. He said I'd find him to be a generous master, so long as I was obedient and discreet. I nodded, picking up the purse and counting the coins inside. I dare say that a woman like you enjoys her privacy, he said. He spoke the words, a woman like you, as though he was making a horrible accusation. I let these loaded words hang in the silence between us for a moment. Then he added, I'll see to it that you have your own private quarters at the Chateau Frankenstein. The dogs began fighting over the last scraps of organ meat I had fed them. Now the flies found this discarded flesh and descended like a black cloud onto what the dogs had left uneaten. I nodded again, choosing not to speak further. Men will hold you to every word you speak out loud, and resent the words you choose not to utter. Still, there is power in silence. I learned that at an early age. Aside from occasionally warming Victor's bed, my primary duty was to manage an extensive network of grave robbers employed by the Frankenstein estate to provide fresh meat for the good doctor's experimentations. I ensured they were all paid promptly and generously enough to thwart any attempts at blackmail or extortion. To that end, I also ensured that no pair of grave robbers, they almost always worked in pairs, knew the identity of the man paying them. I utilized aliases and hired middlemen and other surrogates to ensure that the grave robbers we employed did not know about one another. We could not allow them, for example, to compare notes about our operation. To some, I was Fräulein Sontag. To others, I was Madame Sophie. None of them knew me as Sona, for obvious reasons, but also because none of these brutes could pronounce names from my mother tongue, and because I didn't want to advertise my heritage. Being of Muslim or Romani descent, I am both, was tantamount to witchcraft, and I saw how witches were treated. Two of our grave robbers, Mr. Burke and Mr. Hare, a pair of Scots who traveled the whole of Europe, exhuming bodies and evading capture for their crimes, had a habit of providing medical specimens which were considerably fresher than all the rest. I confronted them. I asked them if they'd been murdering people to sell to my employer. Mr. Burke answered me with a wink. A week later, I hired a man from the village of Carlsbad to kill Burke and Hare. I couldn't run the risk of those two getting Dr. Frankenstein involved with a senseless murder. And there was, of course, the added benefit of procuring the fresh corpses of two stout men for experimentation. I didn't understand why Dr. Frankenstein wanted all the stray meat I provided him. I didn't much care. But I did know he was a collector. He collected the legs of runners, the eyes of jewelers, the hands of sculptors and pianists, and the tongues of eloquent liars like clergymen. He collected his meat the way my grandmother would collect hair and teeth, rocks and herbs, to work magic and to see the future. She knew the old ways, the science of the deep earth, and of the wind in the pines, and the rushing of the river. One night Victor kissed me and embraced me with arms still wet with the blood of a country virgin, a farm girl he'd been dissecting. He spoke of his work and the mysteries of human anatomy with the passion of a traveling balladeer. I asked him why he did the things that he did. He sighed and said, "There are some who would see my work as nothing short of black magic." "Tell me, Sana, what do you know about witchcraft?" I did not respond. There is power in silence.
Those experiments you describe in this vision, they're highly theoretical. They're my own methods for
resurrecting the dead?
If you want to raise the dead, we know simpler methods, eh, girls?
No. Methods for creating new life. For shaping and molding a new man in my own hands. I've never spoken of these theories to anyone. I haven't even put these plans down on paper.
Oh, but you will.
As we have foreseen.
And we have more to show you.
Now the third sister leans over the pot to see what future events she can divine from the movement of the bubbles, the swirling of the vapor.
I am Elizabeth Krempe.
Elizabeth?
My dearest Victor, I have many things to confess in this letter.
The first being the most obvious that I am still alive. At the time I write this letter, anyway. I'm afraid that will be the least terrible of my confessions to you. The one I once loved so fiercely. I think I've always hated you fiercely, too. Perhaps the two feelings are not so different.
The Modern Prometheus, based upon To My Dearest Victor, written by Annie Morgan, narrated by Chrisi Talyn Saje, creator, producer, and star of Madison On The Air.
I know not how much time I have, so I'll skip to the matter of greatest urgency. Our wedding night. We'd only been planning it officially for a year, but really, our wedding had been decided from the moment we first met. When your parents brought me home, and you were enamored with my beauty. They rescued me when I had no place else to go. My parents dead in the war, not a penny to my name. It would be the least I could do to repay their kindness by growing up as your betrothed. I owed them the debt of my life, so it only made sense that my life would belong to them, to do with whatever they pleased. Well, now, I sound bitter, and I don't mean to. My thoughts are a mess. I did love you, but I never had any other choice. And I often wonder if I would have felt the same had we met differently, had I not belonged to you since I was so young. But this is about my sins, not yours, so I'll get back to the point. To the night that I committed the sins that have stained my soul so dreadfully, possibly beyond salvation. The wedding dress was even more beautiful than I could have imagined, and I'd imagined it many times. It was the purest white and so elegant. The ruffles and lace were so plentiful that I could dance, but only just. The dress was so cumbersome, though, that I could not run in it, which I learned soon after the ceremony concluded. Had it been a less lovely night, things might have gone differently. But it was beautiful, so warm and the sky so clear that no one was ready to retire back to the castle. As the festivities tapered off, not a soul could resist wandering the grounds. The mountain started so suddenly that those looking to go for a stroll split into two in either direction on the narrow strip of beach and forest where the hills started. Though no one wandered too far out, we were spread thin enough that when the carnage started, the sand and the trees helped to muffle the screams. Thinking a tragedy of divine nature had found us when we first discovered Felix and Agatha Delancey side by side in the woods, their throats freshly opened. This is my second confession, dear Victor, that when we found them, their lifeblood still spilling out onto the forest floor, a part of me was glad. Agatha had always been so cruel to me, talking always of my poor breeding and how my father must be a terrible soldier to perish so easily. Something wicked in my soul was delighted to see her bleeding out on the forest floor. You left me shortly after this because I could not run, and you heard your dear friend Henry Clerval screaming in the distance. You gave me a torch and told me to hide. You told me there was a terrible beast afoot and that I should burn it if it got close to me. I hid in a shed then, trying to decide if I should extinguish the torch so that nothing peering through the cracks of the old shed might see me, but in doing so, I would be disposing of my only weapon. I listened to your screams of anguish in the distance, and I knew that Henry must have met with a gruesome end. I heard other screams as the night wore on, and my torch burned dangerously low, but I dared not leave my shelter. Hiding in that wretched shed and listening to the bloodshed outside brought back memories of my childhood. It had been a very long time since I'd seen so much blood. But unlike most of the guests at your wedding, I had seen carnage of the worst kind before. What drew me out was the screaming of William, our dear, sweet baby brother. I was out the door before I had time to think, and though I could not run without stumbling, I traveled as fast as I could to those terrible sounds. I tripped and scraped my legs. The flesh on my hands ripped from the countless falls. My lovely dress was destroyed by the branches of the forest. But by the time I found our precious William, it was too late. I saw his killer then, and discovered it was not in fact a beast, but a man. A strange man, but a man nonetheless. He was holding William's body. And though I could only surmise that he had been his killer, he looked mournful. I knew that I could not get away, so I approached him. And to what happened next, I need to once again revisit my bloodied and short childhood to explain myself. I have precious few memories of my life before the war took my parents from me, before I joined your family. Most of them are quite dreadful, and I've told you about many of them, but not all. Growing up, the war was all I knew. It encompassed everything, and I did not know any other way to live. I did not have friends. Us children needed to stay hidden. But one day, a stray cat came to our house. It wanted so badly to be my friend, but friendship was something I had no concept of. The creature wanted to purr and rub its face against my hand, and I did not know what to do with something so gentle. I had never seen its like before. Everything I knew was sad and destroyed and bloody. So I decided that the cat should be too. And I destroyed the poor creature simply because I knew nothing else. When I found the monster holding our dear William, I couldn't help but feel a kinship with it. It was like me in a way. I wondered if perhaps it was simply doing this because it knew nothing else. As I approached, the creature began to cry, and I told it not to weep. And in that small act of kindness, perhaps the only one it had ever known, granted me the time to reason with it. With him. The creature had no name, so I called it Thomas. I named it after a boy I'd known only briefly in my stay at an orphanage before the Frankensteins took me in. Thomas had been a troubled boy, just as we all were, but he'd been almost a friend. I thought of him sometimes, and I'd hoped he was doing well. I know what transpired next will be hard for you to understand, but you have never known sorrow or trouble in the way that I have. Thomas, as I'd named him, and I began to talk, and he told me briefly of his story. Victor, I must say I was disgusted with you for abandoning him. I started to think that perhaps he could learn not to be a monster if only someone would teach him. And I must also confess that after learning of what you did, creating this man and then leaving him to fend for himself as a newborn in the wilderness, I did not want to marry you. More than that, I saw a way out of the life that had been chosen for me. We cut up my dress and doused it in the blood that was plentiful in the forest, so you would think me dead. Then we ran away together. And this is my third confession, that I fell in love with the man who killed our William and so many of our other dear friends. Growing up, I'd often lamented the fact that you would never truly understand me. We'd come from such different worlds. At times, growing up in your lavish house, it felt like we were two different species. And I did not feel that with Thomas, though surely we were farther apart in that regard. We'd both known sorrow and carnage and destruction. Our life was a hectic one, on the run, constantly moving, but completely free of expectations. I did not have to put on airs when I was sad. I did not have to pick out a new dress for each occasion. I thought that we could have lived like that forever and been happy. But Thomas thought otherwise. He would catch me studying the places he was stitched together or the way you could see his veins under the skin. He told me in those moments that he worried I still thought of him as a monster, and I assured him I did not. But I realize now that I never managed to convince him. I don't know when he made this wretched plan of his. I don't know if I could have talked him out of it had I tried harder. But a fortnight ago, he brought me to this old castle and locked me in the dungeon. And since then, I've watched him work on his terrible task. He labored day and night on corpses, piles of them. I didn't realize who they were until I saw Agatha's beloved emerald necklace on a mummified corpse. Then I recognized Henry Clerval's hair, and after that, I stopped looking at the bodies as he piled them in the dungeon beyond my cell. He tried not to look at me, and he ignored my pleas and my demands, except to bring me food or water. But just last night I wore him down, and he explained to me his plan. He said he would never be truly happy with someone like me, someone so different. He said he was going to make me like him. The irony of this is not lost on me, dear Victor. Perhaps it's some divine punishment for my own adultery. The monster confessed also that the parts of the new bride he was making were going to come from those that you had loved, Victor, and that this was simply one final act of revenge. I know not what combination of limbs and organs my final form will have, but the monster, for he'd lost his privilege of having a name, has assured me that his new wife will have my head. I'm sorry, Victor, for thinking that you could not understand me. We were so much closer than I am to this beast. I know I've confessed many sins in this letter, and I know that you must hate me for them. But please, Victor, the monster says it's going to let me go when you're done building its wife. Please find me in whatever form I may be in. Don't let me become like him. I think that even a monster, had it been raised in kindness, would not have turned out the way that this creature did. Come find me, Victor, and right the wrong you did to the world by unleashing this beast. I fear I'll be taken any minute now. I hear your voice in the other room, my dearest, and I know the beast has caught you. And wouldn't you know it? I hear his voice saying the same thing that your mother said to you when she brought me home all those years ago. The monster is saying, Victor, I have a pretty present for you.
Absurd! Your visions paint me as some maker of abominations. I'm a scientist, not a lunatic. Some lunatic like the three of you. What utter nonsense!
With a single swift kick, Frankenstein upends the bubbling cauldron. The weird stew spills out onto the ground, and a cloud of green vapor engulfs all that is in sight. The young anatomist's eye recognizes a human kidney, a femur, and a boiled eyeball among the cauldron's spilt contents.
Ow! Do you know what you have done? Who you have insulted with this blasphemous mockery?
Stay away from me! My work and my beloved Elizabeth are none of your concern. I never want to see you freaks again.
Come back.
We have so much to show you. He leaves, yet he has no wisdom. The spell's wound up.
6 times 6. Damned again.
Do not despair, little sisters.
The voice of the master.
Hail Satan.
I know, my good servants. You've set Victor Frankenstein on the path I've laid out for him all the same.
But how?
Attend this vision, little sisters, and know wisdom.
Their dark master appears from out of the blackness, towering over them in all his satanic majesty. The sisters tremble in his presence, clutching the folds of his inky robes. And then, their minds take flight. They soar on the wings of their master's vision for them, out over the centuries, over a charred, desolate world, a world in which even the Strasbourg Cathedral and the Jungfrau have crumbled to dust in the wake of nuclear fallout. It is a vision from AD 2256. There, on a landmass at the heart of an irradiated sea, its toxic, fetid waters teeming with monstrosities, stands a palace cobbled together from the ruins of the old world. This palace is filled with mutants, twisted caricatures of humanity covered in tumors and lesions, who are attending a man who is part flesh, both old and new, and part machine. This man is their king. He is the monster built centuries ago by the wicked Baron Frankenstein. Eat the Flesh of Frankenstein. Written especially for Octoberpod by Jane Nightshade. From an original idea by Brett Norwood and Edward October. Narrated by Edward October. Well now, the table's all set. the feast laid out, as it were," said the monster, holding court with a legion of his mutant toadies. "Now I suppose you'll have me feed you and entertain you as well. You're a needy lot. So what'll it be then? Would you like to hear of the day the bombs dropped? How the flesh peeled from everyone's bones, and how the sky crawled with lightning, and how it rained radioactive poisons for a fortnight? Perhaps you'd like to hear about how I fought alongside Corso Sangri's terrorists to ensure the nukes would fly. I always did have a death wish. Yes, indeed. There's a funny story about the time I had my old eyes replaced with these optic mechanicals. No? Perhaps you'd like to hear about how I killed Victor Frankenstein on a sheet of ice in the Arctic Sea. Heard that one already, have you? Well, I don't blame you. We've wasted too many words on that sick bastard. I've suffered untold pain on his account, and I don't even have pain receptors. It's what made me such a force to be reckoned with in my heyday. They tried burning me, shooting me, knifing me, axing me, and still I kept coming. You there, with the tumors on your face. What's your table manners? Save that cut for last. You're not setting a good example for your brothers. Now, since this is my last supper, let's have the story of my first supper. And so it was that after escaping the Chateau Frankenstein, I roamed the countryside, not really understanding where I was or what I was. I rested for my first night of freedom in an abandoned barn. I ate a live rat, and the taste of its warm blood made me hungry for more fresh meat. I stayed in the barn for several days, but I grew tired of rats and hungered for something more substantial. As luck would have it, a young stable boy came into the barn looking for a spare axe head. I thought seriously of eating him. I had no concept at the time of humans and animals being any different. And at this ripe old age, I've developed the same problem. Yet I noticed that the boy was limping, and something rose up inside of me that was not pity. I cannot feel pity because of the way my brain is pieced together, besides not having any kind of soul to speak of. But I did feel some kind of kinship with the lad. After all, the legs that Victor made for me never worked very well. I had to have them replaced in the 1960s and again in the 2030s. They're still pretty fresh. The ungainly way I walked was somewhat akin to this boy's limp. He was enough like me that the kinship I felt saved him. He was also a simpleton. I spoke to him from the shadows of a back stall. "You there, boy," I said. "Can you help a hungry old nomad?" Now, I was fresh off the slab. Victor had given me the brain of a scholar, but after having a bolt of lightning shot through me, that brain worked a bit more like the brain of a stroke victim, at least at first. Suffice it to say that while my scrambled brain intended to say the word nomad, it told my mouth to say the word seraphim. Now, you godless, illiterate beggars wouldn't know this, but that's a type of angel. And stop gnawing on that bone, you. There's plenty more meat elsewhere. So now this kid thought I was an angel. A simpleton, that one. And I went along with it. Shit, I didn't know who or what I was back then. So who was I to say I wasn't an angel? So I told him I was on a mission from God, and that he must never tell anyone about me, nor must he ever look at me in the light. For the true beauty of an angel would surely blind him. I told him that if he ever wanted to see Mother Mary in heaven, he'd do anything I asked, starting with getting me some food. His name was Johanna. He received many beatings from his master, the head groom. It was unfair, as his understanding was clearly limited, and thus his ability to do chores was limited also. The head groom was named Hans, a despicable creature. Johann brought me food that he'd stolen, an unplucked chicken whose neck he had broken. I bit off its head like I did with the rats. It wasn't a big chicken, and the next day he brought me a loaf of bread and a small squealing piglet. I felt safe in the abandoned barn. No one used it except for Johann. It was not a good existence, but it was an existence. Victor Frankenstein, in making me, did not extinguish the primitive survival instincts that all living creatures possess. But it had to end. FX flesh eating. Throughout the village, there'd been a rash of petty thievery, and suspicion eventually fell upon Johann. Hans had caught him bringing me a cage full of live pigeons. Hang on. Hang on there. You poxy bastards need to eat more slowly. Make your meal last until I finished my tale. God knows there's precious little of it left. Hans accused Johann of thievery and began beating him with a buggy whip. A crowd of farmhands and stable boys milled around to watch the spectacle. Beat that boy half to death, he did. And oh, how he screamed. Yes, indeed. I had to save him. For my own sake. He brought me food. I couldn't say that I was fond of him because, well, I ain't human, I ain't. But he'd helped me out, and I owed him a debt. Pulled myself up off the floor of my safe little stall and lumbered outside. When I was seen, the usual gasps and terrified cries rang out from the crowd, from Hans, and from a dumbstruck Johann. Hans made a sign of the cross as I approached him. He was tall for a human, but he'd never seen a giant the likes of me. Johann was sat whimpering in the dust, no doubt frightened by my appearance. Definitely not angelic, I warned. I grabbed Hans by the head with my bare hands, and then I pulled, and pulled, and pulled, until his head popped clean off, blood spurting out of his miserable little neck hole like a fountain. My rude clothes were drenched in gore. The crowd screamed and scattered. I knew that the pitchforks and the torches would arrive soon after they regrouped and found some courage and a bottle of schnapps. But in the meantime, I was quite overdue for a proper meal. I dragged the headless Hans into the barn and started eating. Oh, I was dreadfully hungry, dreadfully. Yes, indeed. And now you know why I chose this particular story to tell you, don't you? I ate Hans. Or most of him, anyway. I enjoyed it, just as you were enjoying me. I've laid the table and invited you to feast on the last vestige of Victor Frankenstein's legacy. Tell me, is my flesh tasty, even after 400 years of suffering? Soon you will be at my heart, at my brain, and I will be gone. The horrors and the loneliness of my existence will scatter to the four winds. Eat up. Eat up, miserable bastards. Choke on it.
Ecce impius paro Frankenstein. Ecce crudelis medicus Frankenstein. Ecce modern Prometheus.
Frankenstein.
Ecce monstrum turpe Frankenstein.
Frankenstein.
Celebramus ritus satanica Frankenstein.
Celebramus.
Ave, ave, ave.
Stick around after the credits for a brief word from some of our fellow indie podcasters, creators, and friends. There may even be some bloopers and outtakes as well. You have been listening to Octoberpod. Octoberpod is produced, edited, and directed by Edward October. The series co-producer is MJ McAdams. Logo and banner graphics by Jessica Good. Edward October illustrations based upon an original character design by Nick Calavera. Select still photography courtesy of Unsplash.com. Select music cues by Dr. Dreamchip, various stock music and sound effects courtesy of freesound.org. Music cues from Bigfoot Apocalypse and Thorax, theme from Octoberpod, composed by Nico Vitesi. All other images and music FX cues, except where noted, are sourced from within the public domain. Watch Octoberpod home video on YouTube for new videos each month. Follow us on Instagram and on the dumpster fire formerly known as Twitter at OctoberpodVHS and on TikTok and Blue Sky at Octoberpod. Or find all of our links on the World Wide Web at OctoberpodVHS.com. For business inquiries or story submissions, email octoberpod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed Octoberpod, we'd be very pleased if you told your friends about us. And comment with a 5-star or equivalent rating wherever you're listening. The man who spoke to you was Mr. Edward October.
Do you like your tabletop RPGs to be grim, gritty, and grounded? If so, then Legend of the Bones is the podcast for you. A hybrid of dark fantasy audio drama and old-school solo D&D. In Legend of the Bones, the dice rule. There'll be no rerolls, no fudging the dice, no metacurrency. The roll of the bones will determine the character's destiny, and no one will be spared their fate. None shall escape the destiny of Bone.
I'm Pitney.
And I'm Amelia.
And we're from
Pitney and Amelia's Bitchin' Boutique. Who are we?
Why, we're your new best friends, of course.
Pull up a seat and listen in to what we think about people, places, and things.
Geeky stuff, horror movies, weirdos we know, spirituality, sexuality, food, filth.
It's like eavesdropping on the people at the next table for like an hour or so, and wishing you could join in on their conversation.
Also, do you see who just came in? Look at that hair.
Oh, honey, just... no.
Bitchiness, you're soaking in it.
We soften your hands while you do the dishes.
Pitney and Amelia's Bitchin' Boutique.
We're here.
We're queer. And we're
in your ear. Every other Friday, where all the classiest podcasts are found.
Hey, you. Yes, you. Are you looking for a new podcast that appeals to your scientific curiosity, but is also a little bit spooky?
Show me how I died in a past life.
Well, look no further, because this cat is where it's at.
He had concerns about the ethics surrounding AI, feeling they had achieved consciousness.
Curious Cat Podcast examines the shadowy space where science and the supernatural collide. Listen every week with your host, Jennifer Holtz, as she and her guests explore what it means to be a soul in a meat suit.
We were healing karma together. They were all kind of predestined to resolve something.
Listen on all your favorite streaming apps and continue the conversation on Twitter at CuriousCatPodCA, or find Jennifer and all her links at Jennifer L. Holtz, spelled HOTES.com. All right, here comes Satanic Rites of Frankenstein. Narrator, wraparound narrator. Narrator. The Satanic Rites of Frankenstein.
Ed, I'm going to be honest. I didn't know if I was supposed to do a witchy voice. I don't know if I can do a witchy voice. I tried to be as crony as possible. I will not be offended if you go, Emma, babe, please just use your normal voice. No offense taken. I am not a voice actor. Anyway, I thought my witch cackle was quite good though. So my logic was, witch cackle is not going to go in my normal voice. So anyway, you let me know if you just want me going, Hail Satan, whatever. And if I didn't chant well enough, or I don't know. Anyway, you let me know.
So fuck it. You're going to have to listen to this with that plane or whatever the fuck it is in the background. And you're going to have to fucking like it. Fuck. God damn it.
No! No! Take your pick of them.
There was a rash of petty thefts throughout the village. There was a rash of petty thefts. There was a rash of petty thefts. There was a rash of petty thievery throughout the village.
42. Oh, no. Oh.
13. 13. 13. 13.
22. The last one's 15. 22 drums.
I know, my good servants. You've set Victor Frankton. I'm gonna redo this.
The voice of the master! Jesus, I've lost it. I've no idea what I'm doing. Right, here we go.
56. 56. 56. 56.
55. Did I say the last one's 53? So it is. 55. FX kicks over the cauldron. Thunder.
69. Oi, oi.
Perhaps you'd like to hear about how I fought alongside... Damn it.
Celebramus. Celebramus.
Ave. Ave. Ave.
Prometheus. How
But he'd never seen a giant the likes of me. My head.
Jesus Christ, Ed. Jesus.
I don't fucking hold him.
Take care. Bye.